There is a cabinet in the Library of Congress filled with the voices of dead Americans, not recordings, pages, handwritten interviews, typed recollections, fragments of memory taken down by government writers who were sent across the country with one assignment: find the old people before they disappear and write down what they remember. Most of those pages sat unread for decades, and that matters more than it should, because many of the people who spoke in those interviews were born before the America we take for granted fully existed. They remembered another landscape, another rhythm, another scale of life, a world that seems to vanish right at the edge of the official record. There is a filing cabinet in the Library of Congress that holds the written voices of dead Americans, not audio, not film, transcriptions. Some thousands of pages of interviews collected between 1936 and 1940 by writers working under the Federal Writers Project, one of the New Deal programs created during the Roosevelt years. Their job was simple in wording, but enormous in consequence. Go into homes across the country and record the memories of ordinary people before those memories vanished. They gathered nearly 3,000 life histories from 24 states. Then the interviews were boxed, filed, and mostly forgotten. I came across them while looking for something else. I'd been tracing architectural records from the late 19th century, trying to understand why so many American civic buildings from that era feel strangely out of proportion to the people who supposedly built them and used them. Oversized entrances, vast interiors. Ornament and scale that seem to belong to a confidence our current explanations do not fully account for. But the deeper I went into those archives, the less the buildings felt like the real mystery. The people were the mystery. Because those interviews captured something almost impossible to recreate now. First-hand memory from Americans born before the great transitions of the late 19th century had fully settled into official history. They were not scholars. They were not theorists. They were witnesses. And witnesses often preserve what institutions smooth over. Think about the timeline for a moment. An American born in 1855 who lived to 85 would have died around 1940. That is not an impossible lifespan. It means a person born before the Civil War could still have been alive, speaking clearly and remembering. When government interviewers knocked on the door during the 1930s, such a person would have been a child during the 1860s, a teenager in the 1870s, an adult as the country changed its architecture, its population records, its cities, its mythologies, and perhaps the way it understood its own past. Their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, would have heard those stories directly. That matters, because those grandchildren were the last generation to receive by word-of-mouth memories from people who had lived before the world we call modern America fully hardened into place. Some of those long-lived Americans are easy to overlook because they sound ordinary on paper. A woman born in the early 1850s who dies in the 1960s. A man born before the railroads fully transformed his county who lives long enough to see television. A formerly enslaved woman's child who lives into the end of the 20th century. These lives sound exceptional only when you stop and place them against the years they bridged. They did not live through one America, they lived through two. And the government had a brief chance to ask them what changed. It recorded a fraction of them. Then it stopped. The project was cut back, shifted, and effectively smothered before anything like a full national memory could be assembled. The interviews that did survive were not made widely accessible for decades, so the last large-scale attempt to collect first-hand testimony from Americans who remembered the older world passed into silence almost as soon as it was created. That silence becomes harder to ignore when you follow the dates. Take October 8th, 1871. Or every schoolchild hears about the Great Chicago Fire. The story is polished into something familiar. A city of wood, an accident, a disaster, a rebuilding. But that same night, across a much wider geography, immense fires erupted in multiple regions of the upper Midwest. Peshtigo, Wisconsin was consumed in what survivors described not as an ordinary fire, but as something closer to a storm of flame. Entire areas were overtaken with terrifying speed. Accounts describe heat so extreme that people died before visible flames seemed to reach them. Winds moved with such force that the event ceased to feel like a simple blaze and began to resemble a system turning violent on a scale people could barely describe. That same evening, fires broke out across parts of Michigan and beyond. Entire communities were threatened or destroyed. The simultaneity of it has disturbed observers for more than a century. Drought, Slash debris and wind explain part of it. They do not erase the strangeness of the timing, and here is the point that matters for this story. The old people interviewed in the 1930s were children when the sky burned in 1871. A person aged 80 in 1938 would have been 13 that year. Old enough to remember smoke. Old enough to remember adults panicking. Old enough to carry the story of that night for the next 70 years. Even a younger interview subject might have grown up in a household where the event was not history but family memory. A thing told at the table, a thing repeated in winter, a thing that changed how a region understood itself. So what did they say? What details lived in those testimonies that never made it into textbooks? What descriptions of fire, sky, buildings and aftermath were written down by federal workers, then filed away where almost no one would read them? That question gets heavier when you place it next to another disappearance. In 1890, the United States conducted the most detailed census it had yet attempted. Nearly 63 million people were documented in extraordinary detail. Families, origins, occupations, property, migration, military service, language, status. It was a record of the country during a period of massive change. It should have been a cornerstone archive. Instead, it became one of the great voids in American record-keeping. Unlike earlier censuses, which had local backup copies distributed through counties and states, the 1890 census was centralized in a single location. Then, in 1921, a fire broke out in the basement where it was stored. Some records were destroyed immediately. Many more were damaged by smoke and water, and what remained was not urgently restored. It was warehoused, delayed, neglected, and eventually scheduled for disposal. That is the part I cannot read without stopping. Not the fire, the sequence. First damage, then inertia, then paperwork, then authorized destruction. By the time preservation was possible, the country chose disposal instead. The National Archives was about to rise specifically to prevent exactly this sort of loss, and yet the most detailed record of Americans living through that transitional era was allowed to vanish almost completely. Of tens of millions of names, only a tiny fraction remained, a nationwide memory narrowed to scraps. One event can be dismissed as bad luck, two as carelessness. But when archival loss, interrupted testimony, and population displacement begin clustering around the same decades, the pattern starts to press on the mind. And then there were the children. Between the 1850s and the late 1920s, hundreds of thousands of children were transported out of eastern cities and placed into rural communities across the Midwest and West through what became known as the orphan train movement. Some were true orphans, many were not. Many came from poor families, immigrant families, unstable households, or circumstances in which institutions held more power than parents did. At train stops, the children were displayed and selected. Even now, the language around it tries to soften the image. But the records and recollections often point towards something harsher. Children inspected, judged, and sorted and removed from the only past they knew. And once placed, many were cut off from their origins, names changed, records blurred, parents disappeared into paperwork, children grew into adults unable to tell their own descendants where they came from, because the institutions that moved them had preserved the transfer more carefully than the identity. That is not merely poverty relief, that is severance. And again, the timing matters. Fires, dislocated children, destroyed records, vanishing local continuity, a generation growing up with altered names, uncertain origins, and no easy way back into the truth of its own beginning. By itself, each category belongs to familiar history. Together, they create a far stranger emotional landscape than official summaries usually allow. Then you arrive at the architecture. By the late 19th century, American cities were still filled with monumental structures whose scale, ornament, and confidence seemed to belong to a civilization speaking in a different tone than the one that followed. Courthouses, stations, exposition buildings, state houses, institutions, facades with Roman ambitions and dimensions that continue to provoke the same uneasy question. Why does so much of this feel older than the explanations attached to it? The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago remains one of the clearest examples. An entire city of grand neoclassical forms raised, displayed, and then mostly erased. Officially, these were temporary exhibition buildings constructed rapidly from staff and fibre over frames, then demolished after their purpose was served. That explanation is accepted. And yet the imagery of the White City still exerts a peculiar power over anyone who studies it too long. It does not feel like a fairground. It feels like a memory of scale, a memory of order, a memory of a built world that seemed, even then, to stand outside ordinary explanation. Some of the elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s had seen those places. As children, as visitors, as people who walked through structures their grandchildren would only know through photographs. What did those witnesses say about them? How did they compare what they saw in youth to the America forming around them later in life? That is where this story becomes most difficult to dismiss emotionally, even when every individual piece remains historically arguable, because there must have been, in county after county across America, old women and old men sitting in modest houses in the 1940s and 1950s, telling younger relatives about a country that no longer quite matched itself. A woman born in 1858, perhaps. A man born in 1852. Someone who remembered buildings that seemed too large, cities that changed too quickly, names that vanished from maps, records that no one could retrieve, people whose beginnings had been erased, and nights of destruction still carried in local memory long after the textbooks had simplified them. And when they spoke, what happened? Maybe the family listened. Maybe they smiled politely. Maybe they changed the subject. Because once a society settles on a usable version of itself, contradictory memory becomes embarrassing, not always dangerous, often just inconvenient, too large, too untidy, too difficult to place inside the timeline everyone has agreed to teach. That may be the saddest part of all. Not only that records were lost, not only that witnesses died, but that many of the last living carriers of older memory probably spoke into rooms that could no longer receive what they were saying. The Federal Writers Project caught some of them, nearly 3,000 testimonies, 24 states. That is not enough to reconstruct a nation, but it is enough to prove something vital. The chain was still alive. The people were still here. The memory had not yet fully broken. Then the effort ended. And what of the states not covered? What of the old people no one interviewed? What of the stories passed not to a government worker with a notebook, but to a granddaughter at a kitchen table, or a grandson standing on a porch, or a room full of relatives after supper, while the oldest person present described a world no one else had seen? Those grandchildren are nearly gone now. They were the last human bridge to the witnesses, and that leaves us with paper. The interviews still exist. The words still exist. The archives still exist. They can be searched, read, compared, and studied, which raises a question that feels almost unbearable in its simplicity. Has anyone read all of them carefully enough? Not just for folklore, not just for charming local detail, but for rupture, for the places where memory does not align neatly with official chronology, for repeated descriptions that point towards something omitted, compressed, or standardized out of public understanding, for references to buildings, disasters, proportions, technologies, relocations. These are names that suggest the transition into modern America was experienced by ordinary people as something far stranger than our textbooks admit. The last Americans who remembered that older world are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone too. But the archive remains, and archives have a way of preserving what public memory abandons. A building can be demolished and still survive in a photograph. A census can be destroyed and still leave behind the shape of its absence. A child can be renamed and still carry the wound of severed origin into the next generation. A witness can die and still speak through careful handwriting on government paper. That is why these interviews matter. Not because they prove every grand theory someone might wish to force upon them, but because they preserve the texture of first-hand memory from a period when America may have felt more discontinuous, more unstable, and more transformed than later narratives are comfortable admitting. Somewhere in those pages are the last unguarded descriptions of a country in transition, a country still close enough to an older reality that the people who had lived inside it could say, without theory, without agenda, simply from memory, "This is what I saw. This is what they told me. This is what used to be here." And if those voices were boxed up and left unread for decades, that does not mean they lost their value. It may mean we arrived too late to understand how important they were, but not too late to read them.